Okay, the portion of Tazria. Vaydaber Shem Moshe Lemor. Darbel Bnei Yisrael Lemor. Speak to the Bnei Yisrael, the Jewish people, saying, Isha ki Tazria, a woman who conceives v'yolda zochar, as she gives birth to a male. The Toma Shivas Yomim. When she gives birth to a male, she enters into a contaminated status for 7 days. Nidas Dvosa Titma, the equivalent of the days of menstruation, the days of the flow of menstruation. What does this mean? The law is, according to the laws of family purity, which is a Torah law, if a woman has any sighting of blood, menstrual blood, whether it's a speck, whether she continuously bleeds for 7 days, and she stops before the 7 days are over, the 8th night, the Torah says she's permitted to go to the mikveh or a wellspring, which is, let's say, the ocean, a river. If she immerses herself properly, she's no longer in a contaminated state. Whether she menstruates for a moment or continuously, as long as it ceases at the end of the 7-day period, she can go to the mikveh. And if she fully immerses herself, she's permitted. She's no longer contaminated in terms of the laws of family purity. What about if a woman gives birth, and today it's inconceivable, and when she gives birth, there's no blood. The woman is so malnourished. The child is born and there's no blood. No blood comes out of the uterus. There's no uterine blood. Nevertheless, the act of birth, a child being born, that brings about the identical level of contamination as a woman who normally menstruates. And that's what Torah says. A woman who conceives and gives birth to a male, she becomes contaminated upon giving birth, the equivalent of the day that she menstruates, the days of menstruation, because otherwise the question is, if when she gives birth there's menstrual blood, what do we have to speak about? Because she gave birth to a male, she's contaminated because she's menstruating. It's the equivalent of the same thing. So therefore, the Gemara, the Talmud tells us, we're speaking about there is no menstrual blood. And we're not talking about it, this is a Syrian. It's not a C-section. It's a regular, normal delivery, and there's no blood. Nevertheless, the act of giving birth brings about that contaminated state. That's what the Torah is telling us. We'll see in a moment. Now, in last week's reading, the Torah speaks about the laws which pertain to species, kosher species, not kosher species. If it's an animal, whether it's domesticated or undomesticated, it has to have 2 signs to be classified as a kosher species. It has to chew its cud, it has to split hooves. If it's a fish, to be classified as a kosher species, it has to have scales, it has to have fins. And then it speaks about other types of the equivalent of almost insects, grasshoppers. The kosher species, the non-kosher species. And Rashi over there explains, based on the Gemara, that since today we're not fully adept in identifying what is and what's not, so therefore we don't need any type of grasshopper, because it's based on the classification of that grasshopper. It's a known fact. Yemenite Jews, based on their tradition, they claim they know exactly what is the kosher species, not kosher species. Therefore, Yemenite Jews, they eat grasshoppers, the kosher species. But that's what the Torah speaks about in last week's reading. So the Torah speaks about the laws which pertain to the unintelligible living creature. In this week's parsha portion, the Torah speaks about the laws which pertain to the human being. What is the status of the human being? When is the human being contaminated? When does the human not be contaminated? Whether it's a male is born, whether we'll discuss whether a female is born, the child, if it's a male, the child has to be circumcised on the 8th day, and so on and so forth. So we'll see Rashi in a moment. And there's a famous statement from Reb Simloi, the first Rashi. Ishiki Sazria, Reb Simloi, Shem Yitziraso Shel Odom, Acha Kol Behema Chayva B'Maaseh Bereishis. Just as the formation of man came about after the animal, domesticated, undomesticated animal, and the bird at the time of creation, and then at the end, it was man was created. Kach Toroso, identically the laws which pertain to these species, this Parsha Acha Torah Behema Chayvov. Okay, so just as the order of creation, first the Torah tells us God created all the other living species and man was the last creation. Identically, the laws, the order of the laws which pertain to these creatures are all spoken about first, and then we speak about the laws which pertain to the human being himself. We'd once said in name of Rabbeinu Bachya, what is the indication that the human being is the purpose and the center of creation, and all creation was created on behalf of the human being? So Rabbeinu Bachya explains that because the human being was created at the very last, meaning God wanted everything should be in place. What is the objective of creation? The man has a setting where every level of challenge and every level of purpose and every level of accommodation is in place to provide whatever those accommodations are. So that he was created at the very end of creation tells us that all creation was created only to accommodate the human being's needs, whether it's physical needs, his spiritual needs, whatever they may be. And then he's created at the very end. Now, the laws which pertain to all these various living creatures, what are permitted, what are not permitted, what relevance do they have? Why did God create species with 2 signs or 1 sign or no signs to indicate the classification, whether they're kosher or not, regarding dietary laws? And it only pertains to the human being, or we should say more specific to the Jew, because the non-Jew has no relevance to this. The laws of dietary laws have no relevance to the non-Jew. They're permitted to eat anything they choose, except for Eivim min Achai. Can't eat a limb off a living creature if it's removed when the animal's alive. But everything else, so just as the species was created to accommodate the physicality of the Adam, identically the laws which the Torah discusses, those laws are only pertain to the Adam. Adam means the person who's classified as Adam. That's that person was that spiritual potential that all existence was created on his behalf. Those laws are first discussed, because meaning all the manifestations, which are the basis for those laws, are only in place only to accommodate the spiritual objective of the Jew, which is Adam. And that's what Simloi says, just as Yitziraso Shechaya Behema Chayva preceded the creation of man, identically the laws of the species are stated in Torah before the Torah speaks about laws which pertain to the human being himself. Once said, the law is that tefillin, Sefer Torah mezuzah, the hide or the parchment has to come from a kosher species. It's not a kosher species, although it's leather, it doesn't qualify for tefillin or for Sefer Torah or for mezuzah. Now, why was an animal? God created existence. He created species with hides. Kosher species, not kosher species. Why? If we say that that the blueprint for creation is the Torah, that is the blueprint. I mean, there's nothing in existence which is superfluous. Every aspect of existence it exists only because it has relevance to the Torah itself. As a result of that, the reason why the animal has to have a hide is since we have to have tefillin, and tefillin must be made of leather. It must be made of the hide of a kosher species. You have the kosher species, you have non-kosher species. You have the hide that qualifies for tefillin, and you have the hide that does not qualify for tefillin. So therefore, the laws of the animal, why do animals have two signs, one sign, or no signs? Because that relates to the dietary laws of a Jew. If it has two signs, that's classified as a kosher species. If it has no signs or one sign, it's not classified as a kosher species. So that's what Reb Shmuel is saying. Just as the Yitziroso shell, Behema Chai V'Of, preceded the creation of man, identically, the laws are stated in the Torah first, only because it has relevance to man. Therefore, the human being is the objective of all these laws which are stated in the Torah. That's the understanding. Now, it's interesting. We just finished Pesach. Chometz has a representation of what? The evil inclination is connoted or equated to Chometz. Discuss this is based on the Zohar, based on many other sources, that just as Chometz, something that's leavened, it rises. And it, through the fermentation process, it's tastier. Identically, the Chometz is not permitted, because what does it represent? What's gaiva? What is haughtiness? Person feels he's more worthy, more entitled, because he believes certain things. And therefore, that person will cross many lines, which he's not permitted to cross, because he feels that sense of entitlement. That's called gaiva. What's anivus? Anivus is what? A person's humility, humble. He prefers to be unassuming if he doesn't have to be obvious. Unless that has a purpose, he keeps a low profile. That's anivus. And we find that anivus is a prerequisite to Torah. The Gemara tells us in Tainus that the Torah is equated to three liquids: water, wine, and milk. Why water? So the Gemara says just as water flows from an elevated location to a low location, identically, Torah niknis elamisha data shveva. The Torah can only be acquired by a person whose his mindset is lowly. He's a humble person. He is the repository or the processing center for Torah itself. We have in Rabbeinu Yonah, Shari Tshuva, which we study. Rabbeinu Yonah writes, there's a pasuk where the pasuk says that Tovas Hashem Kogova Lev, that a person has like a swollen heart, an uplifted heart. He's a Tovas Hashem. He's an abomination to God. The Gemara tells us that Gemara Sota, that a person who's a Balgaiva, God says the world is not big enough for both of us. Because a person's self-centered, God's value is only to accommodate him. God says, the world's not big enough for both of us. Therefore, God says it's Tovas Hashem. To be able to do tshuva, one has to have special divine intervention. Needs siyata d'shmaya. So he says a person who's a balgaiva, for that person, the tshuva is very difficult. Because if you need God's intervention, God's assistance, and since he has a representation of a characteristic, which to God is an abomination, it's Tovas Hashem, it's an abomination to God. God doesn't want to be associated with that person. So that person will lack that special assistance. For that person who tshuva, it's not going to be simple. Identically, without siyata d'shmaya, without divine assistance, you cannot come upon the truth of Torah. So if a person does not have the characteristic of water which flows from an elevated location to a low location, he doesn't have that characteristic of humility, God will not give him that special divine assistant to come upon the truth of Torah. Therefore, that's how Torah is equated to water. You have to have that characteristic. And that's matzah. Matzah, it's low, and also it's bland, which represents something which is not as desirable, as tasty. Otherwise, we're drawn after our desires. Fermentation. just to throw it in as an aside, when we all grew up, most Jews who were observant Jews, or even not observant Jews, unless you were like from the higher echelon of society, when did we drink wine? And what kind of wine did we drink? If you drank kosher wine, you drank Malaga wine, Concord at best. That's what you drank. No imported wines, no dry wines, no this wine. It was one wine. When did you drink wine? On a Shabbos or Yom Tov, you had a Kiddush, you had a Simcha, you rejoiced, you had wine. Today, go to a restaurant, they give you the wine menu. Right? It's a whole different reality. Now, what is wine? What's the difference between grape juice and wine? Grape juice is the extract of the grape. When the juice of the grape ferments, it's a fermentation process. That's when the wine, that's when alcohol, that's the basis for the alcohol in the wine. The Gemara has a shaila question in Sanhedrin and Brochos. What exactly was the fruit of the Eitz Hadas? So Rameir says that the fruit of the Eitz Hadas was the grape. Why the grape? Because we find that the greatest tragedies that come upon humanity is drunkenness, intoxication. People destroy their lives due to drinking. So therefore, it's logical to say, as Rameir says, it's logical to say that since we find alcoholism destroys humanity, as a result of that, what undermined initially humanity, the Eitz Hadas, the tree of knowledge, the fruit that Adam was not permitted to eat, makes sense. Logically, it probably was the grape. But again, what's the difference between the extra, what is that? What does it bring tragedy upon humanity? Again, it's the same fermentation process. Just as the flour or the grain and the water interact, it creates that fermentation, which makes it more desirable and causes the change. Identically, when you have gaiva, when you feel entitled, you believe the world is yours as you choose to use it. I always say that, life is a two-sided coin. The Mishnah tells us in Sanhedrin, why was Adam created as a single individual, not with a counterpart like every other living species? Every other living species was created with a male and a female. Adam initially was created only as a male, and afterwards God says it's not good for man to be by himself. I'll create a helpmate opposite him to assist him. Why initially did he create him as a single individual? Because a person should say that Bishvili Nivra Olam. Bishvili Nivra Olam, what does that mean? You look at this world, it's something which borders on the infinite. And Adam was created as a single individual. Adam looks at this world and he says, this world was created for me, meaning the objective of my value is so unlimited, God had to create a whole existence to accommodate that objective. That only gives the person understanding what's incumbent upon him, to what degree his level of responsibility to live a responsible life. That's why God created this whole existence. That's Bishvili Nivra Olam. That has to be the human being's takeaway. But there's another side to the coin. Bishvili Nivra Olam. The world is my playground. It's all mine. And there's not enough time in life to take it all in. So you better get started real soon. Because otherwise, life is really quick. Bishvili Nivra Olam. The world was created for me, therefore I have a right to indulge. I have a right, I feel entitled. Because the world is mine. That's the other side of the coin. And that's the struggle over here. Is it the physicality of the world? Is that the objective? That's the end? Or the world is only a means? It's a means for an objective to address my spiritual potential. And that's the struggle in life. Every one of us. And that was Adam. Bishvili Nivra Olam. He felt he had a right. And he was entitled. He could partake of that fruit, which Hashem says no. Somehow he justified it. He had a right to justify. but that's the intoxication. If you go like Rameh, that was the grape. Similar to the chametz, it's the fermentation process. God gives us something pure, and afterwards, what happened? By tampering with it, it becomes a little convoluted. And that's most people's lives. You have to walk that straight and narrow path. We veer, we fall off once in a while, but ultimately we have to get back. There's no perfect tzaddik. Shlomo says in Keles, ain't tzaddik or tzaddik, yastov lo yechto. There's no such thing as the perfect tzaddik. That's it, that's life. So therefore, but we see there are many takeaways, just as Yitziroso shel Be'ebachai v'of, the creation of the animal, domesticated, undomesticated, the bird, preceded the creation of the human being. Identically, the laws which pertain to it are stated first, because those laws only have relevance to them because man is meant to follow, and he's bound by those laws. That's the understanding.